In Holy Week of 1945, the destruction of the old German town of Danzig was completed. It was the eve of that dreadful night, the 27th of March. On that fearful night, the city of Danzig and all the Vistula area were in flames. An eyewitness report stated, from as far away as Hela, a wall of flames and smoke, 3,000 to 4,000 meters high, could be seen over the city. It had been caused by air raids with high explosive and incendiary bombs. The book Unvergänglicher Schmerz, or Endless Agony, is a record of the history of Danzig's fateful year of 1945 by Peter Porala. The section Das Inferno reads as follows. The enormous development of heat in burning Danzig prevented German units becoming established in the town. So it was only at the entrance to Danzig, between the Schichau Wharf, the Oliver Tor, taking in the Hogelsberg and the Bischofsberg, that a weak defensive line was constructed. Our soldiers were fighting there doggedly against the superior might of the enemy. There was always the certainty that every minute's delay to the Soviet advance meant that some women and girls were saved from being assaulted. There was the possibility, too, that children and old people could flee. In actual fact, they still succeeded in getting thousands every day across the bay to Hela, and from there across the Baltic into the safer west. There are daily records showing the movement of 46,000 persons. On the evening of the 27th of March, the Russians succeeded in breaking through the Schicherogasse to the Hansaplatz, and from there to the main railway station. Our soldiers were at the end of their strength. They were short of ammunition and weapons. There were no more replacements for the dead and wounded. The German Army Command therefore decided to retreat to the Motlau, and finally across the Vistula towards Hubude and Plenendorf. Danzig was occupied by the Red Army. On Good Friday, the 30th of March 1945, Danzig's fate was sealed. For Danzig's population and the many refugees from East Prussia and Pomerania, there began a Via Dolorosa of indescribable horror. The Soviets, and a little later the Poles, took their revenge on the innocents, on children, on women, on old people. That was done with unimaginable atrocity and brute force. What the people in Danzig at that time had to undergo, nobody can begin to imagine. Thousands, oppressed and beaten, committed suicide. Many women and children begged and pleaded, "Shoot me!" Entire families were wiped out, shot or murdered, because they wanted to protect children from being assaulted or were not quick enough to hand over their jewelry. Robbery, plunder and assault were committed day after day by the Soviets, and by the Poles who turned up later. They suffered death through hunger and diseases for weeks and months on end. That was the fate of the people who did not succeed in fleeing across the sea. 1 in every 4 inhabitants of Danzig lost their lives as a result of war and from outrages committed by the Soviets and the Poles. They were starved to death during the Polish occupation. They died in forced labor camps. They died because they were not given proper help when they fell ill. At least as high must be the number of victims among the refugees from East Prussia and Pomerania who remained in Danzig. That the city of Danzig was an ocean of fire was also described in the divisional history. Hauptmann Franz Hrabowski described it there and added to his description of the misery of the refugees. In addition, the women, concerned for the lives of their children, begged the soldiers many times to give up the fight. So it happened that in many places the officers, even using all their authority, did not always succeed in getting their people back out of the cellars. That was supplemented by an eyewitness account in Porala, according to which in the Halbe Allee and also in the Gross Allee, deserters are said to have been hanged in rows. During the next few hours, our rooms were entered again and again by other Russians who behaved very differently. Many threatened us with their weapons, but in many you could see something like pity. Young members of the Komsomol, perhaps 16 years old, were the worst. One waved his machine pistol slowly from bed to bed, and then stopped in front of Franz Manhart, aiming at his head. I can still see Franz's profile with the questioning expression on his face, especially the detail of the eyelid of his left eye opening and closing, while the young Russian, it seemed to last minutes, but it could only have been seconds, had him in his sights. I can still see, too, how another held a pistol, a German 08 at Oberleutnant Neibert's temple. I can see Norbert turning his eyes upwards in order, in the last second of his life, to look his murderer in the face. But on both occasions the Russians did not pull the trigger. From that I concluded that they obviously did not have a general order to kill wounded men, nor particularly officers. Almost amusing when compared with the situations mentioned above, in which you were hovering between life and death, was how our watches were taken away. They were collected up in a procedure to which the main interest of the individual members of the Red Army seemed to be directed, as they said, Uhr ist? Because I had left my service watch behind at my unit when I was wounded, I no longer had a watch, and had to try to express this with gestures of helplessness. That seemed to be incomprehensible to one of the busy plunderers, because with his index finger on my forehead, he pushed my head back onto the straw-filled pillow. Officers also came into our room. I can clearly remember a tall, blonde young major who spoke German and was an artilleryman. When he asked how I had been wounded, I replied to please him, by artillery, which in fact did please him. In conversation, one of us said that the war was over for us, to which the major replied that it was only just beginning. In actual fact, at that time, many Russians were convinced that with the downfall of Hitler's Germany, the capitalist Western powers would then turn against Russia. I found it to be more than a friendly gesture when a captain, before the officers moved on, brought out a bottle of plundered schnapps from his overcoat and reached it over to me in bed. Of course, none of us exhausted wounded men would have been capable even of taking one gulp from it, so I hid the bottle in my bunk under the straw mattress. After some hours of continually being visited by Russians, we were pleased that the last assault had passed off so lightly for us helpless men. The fact that we had not yet received any food that day was unimportant. Indeed, none of us felt hungry or thirsty. After all, we had escaped with our lives. We also did not see anything of the medics who had stayed behind. We understood that none of them risked coming up to us on the second story. Similarly, little was to be seen of the two doctors. I still know their names and can remember what they looked like. One of them was the Munich surgeon, Dr. Stadl-Eichel. He was compact in appearance and gave the impression of being busy. The other was a senior doctor from the Greifenwald University Clinic by the name of Dr. Wolf. He was tall, slim, and with a relaxed manner. Meanwhile, there was no question of a normalization of conditions so soon after the hospital was handed over. German shells were still exploding. However, a new development was that the unmistakable smell of burning was spreading through the building. The air in the house was thickening into fumes heavy with smoke. Nobody knew whether the building had been set on fire by German gunfire, or had been set alight by the Russians, or perhaps even by the Poles. It later turned out that it was arson. In fact, it was said that, of the 800 seriously wounded men who had remained behind, 150 lost their lives in that fire. The saviour of the men in our ward was Franz Manhart. It must have been after midday, and the fumes were apparently preventing the Russians from moving about freely in the building. Franzel took advantage of the opportunity to seek out a way that we could save ourselves. He succeeded in discovering a staircase close to our ward. Although wide, the stairway itself was blocked with the furniture that had been in the rooms before the hospital was set up. Nevertheless, enough space had been left for one man to get through between the banister and the furniture. For us, it was a matter of leaving our beds and struggling through that exit to freedom. For Eberhard Nabert and me, I can only remember the two of us, it was a risky undertaking. Neither of us had left his bed since we had been wounded. I was so enfeebled that I could scarcely stand. With little time, I did not know what I should take with me. I can still remember that I only had on my collarless soldier's shirt, and that I put my field tunic on over it. I needed both arms to hold onto the wall and to the banister. Under Franzel's direction, we managed to get out into the open and into a sort of yard. There were remarkable scenes that I can only recall happening in a blur. Wounded men who seemed to have just got out into the open were lying on the bare earth and only crawling or scrabbling about. Others were being taken by helpers, including Russian soldiers, to an undetermined destination. Russians seemed to be still plundering and arguing over plunder. One of them had several wristwatches on his arm. Smoke was still belching from the building. Flames could not yet be seen. The THs went up in flames. It shared the fate of many buildings that were destroyed by fire only after they had been taken over by the occupation forces. Free of smoke and fumes was a single-story building that had served as a physics laboratory, as could be seen from the wide windows reaching to the roof. That area had similarly been set up with basic bunks that were all occupied, of course. Because of the fire, it had been necessary to fill each bed with 2 or 3 wounded men. I had the good fortune to have to share such a bed with only one comrade. In the next 3 days and nights it was our refuge. My comrade must have been wounded in the head, because they had bandaged his skull in such a way that only one eye, his nose and his mouth could still be seen. When he spoke incoherently, but soon I could tell, at least by his accent, that he must be from Vienna. When during the night he was rambling in his coma, I began to recognize him more and more, and finally I was able to identify him as a comrade from my own regiment. He was Lieutenant Robert Kelker, who had relieved me in the summer of 1944 as second orderly officer with Major von Gahn. It was a sad but unusual reunion. It was dreadful that German women and girls had hidden themselves between and under the emergency beds. Of course, the Russians noticed. Again and again a Russian would come past, track down a woman and wave or drag her out. According to their temperament, the women would be led out of the room by their violators, either resisting or resigned. The next day or the day after that, the Russians were looking for men who had not been wounded, who might have been able to go to ground among us. One Russian went from bed to bed and ordered, "Aufstehen," which for most of us was not possible, whereupon he shouted, "Schlafen," after which we were allowed to stretch out again. I have to say that no healthy man was among the wounded. That was on Easter Sunday. Women continued to hide in the room, and when their torturers had let them go, returned to us again. A certain Friedel obviously felt particularly attached to me. On Easter Sunday, after something dreadful had apparently happened to her, she came back into the room, visibly overflowing with emotion. Without a word, she dashed over to me. In the week after Easter, we were transported to the complex of the medical academy. It seemed to be an intact hospital, and not a temporary military hospital as the TH had been. We were moved over there in Sankas. The drivers were Russians, but the porters were German prisoners. As we were being loaded up and unloaded, we were surrounded by Polish civilians who followed the proceedings with hostility. It is true that Danzig had not possessed a university, but as well as the technical high school, it had had this medical academy, where it was possible to study medicine before the collapse. Head of surgery was Professor Close, an old gentleman. His senior registrar, Dr. Johansson, was middle-aged. The rounds of those two gentlemen provided a welcome change. As civilian doctors in a university clinic, the operation of a military hospital was strange to them. They carried out their work as they had been accustomed to do, and as the conquerors permitted. There were even private consultations. Professor Close, as we found out, enjoyed a measure of respect in the eyes of the Russians. In 1932, he had operated for acute appendicitis on the Russian state president Kalinin, who had been on a cruiser on the way to a state visit to Sweden. Professor Close, a worthy and corpulent gentleman, told us that he spent his summer holidays in Pechtoldsdorf near Vienna, where he had a house. One day he reported, but this was certainly not true, that the express train connection from Danzig to Vienna had been re-established. The senior registrar, Johansson, was a cheerful, bright man who shared our pleasure when a cure was progressing well. From the conversations I had, I recall the theme of the future, which, in accordance with the euphoria of the convalescent, appeared to us in rosy hues. Conversing with Dr. Close and Dr. Johansson, I told them about my parents' parsonage and told them that I, too, would most want to study theology. We did not stay long in the medical academy. Instead of the many Russians who at the beginning continued to come, then it was Poles in some kind of official capacity. The hospital was evidently taken over by a kind of Polish civilian administration. Various commissions came, of which it was said that they were Lublin Poles. That is, they belonged to the wing of the Polish resistance that was allied to Russia. I can recall a civilian doctor who had a 7-figure number tattooed on his lower arm. He showed it to us and said that he had got it in a concentration camp. In the Third Reich we had heard by hearsay of the existence of such camps above all Dachau, but we knew nothing at all of their extent and of what their inmates had to suffer. At one of those inspections by Poles, a German-speaking communist was present. He had fun rocking on my bed in order to hurt me. He succeeded too, but I was even more astonished at the sadistic temperament of a man expressing itself in such a way. From the shell splinter injury on my left buttock, an abscess had formed. It required opening by a lengthy cut at the top of my upper thigh. Today, I cannot recall whether this intervention was carried out while we were still in the TH, or whether it was carried out by Dr. Johansson in the academy, but I do remember that afterwards, for some weeks, I was only able to lie with my leg drawn up. There was as yet no question of getting out of bed, especially as I was also really weakened by hunger. In the sick room, food was an important topic of conversation. Doubtless it was a sign that we were getting better. We imagined what sort of celebration meals we would have if, with God's help, we were once again able to eat them. It must have been about the 20th of April that we were moved in cattle wagons by rail to Thorn. That was about 150 kilometres away up the Vistula. In Thorn there still remained from the war a large barracks camp, in which Allied prisoners of war had been held after the German victories. So the camp was filled with us, the final losers. As far as I could establish, as well as soldiers and officers who had been taken prisoner uninjured, the camp also came to house many wounded and sick men. Dysentery and typhus were rife. Those who had become sick with those diseases were isolated in their own barracks. From them, day after day, were brought out in the morning the bodies of those men who had died the previous night. Most of the camp inmates were dystrophic, recognizable by their edemas due to hunger, by swollen legs and faces. On their arrival in the camp, both the healthy and the sick had to go into the sauna, the banja. No consideration was given to fever and the danger of pneumonia. I saw wounded men, running a temperature of 40 degrees, who had to go into the hot sauna and afterwards would lie for hours on end in the train on the way to the barracks. The wounded not only died of dysentery and typhus, but also, it seemed to me, simply of debility due to their wounds and a lack of sufficient nourishment. In our sick barracks, in which I had ended up with Franzl Manhart, the thin soup handed out twice a day by way of food was distributed out of a pot. The pot, after it had been brought in, was set up in the barrack block, and then every man received his dollop from the ladle into his canteen. The many men who were confined to their beds were served their food by medics. One thing remains unforgettable to me. In that barrack block, officers and men were not separated. One comrade was at the point of death. The medic, who had seen this, quickly put next to his pillow the canteen of the man who was lying at his last gasp. After the wounded man was dead, the medic hurriedly removed the canteen. In that way, he got a second portion for himself. Even today I can see the scene. The medic lurked there watching the man, who was still alive. Then, after the man's life was over, he tucked into the dead man's soup ration. After our arrival in the camp, and before we were put into the barracks, I had lain in one of the several Finnish tents which were provided for seriously wounded men. The Finnish tents were made of plywood and were taller than a man, so that the people lay in 2 layers over each other. I lay in the lower layer, and I remember a Latvian SS lieutenant who lay diagonally above me. His arm had suffered paraplegia and dropped everything down. It was terrible, because his arm was not cleaned. Beside me there lay another Kriegsfreiwilliger Latvian officer. His Christian name was Antons. He had had one leg amputated and in the other had an extensive flesh wound, but he had still kept his leg. As well as his native language, Anton spoke fluent German and Russian, so I was able to have some good conversations with him. He was completely without illusions in contemplating his future. He was enormously collected and self-controlled. As a Soviet citizen who had opposed the Bolsheviks, he might expect their revenge and a completely uncertain future. The Russian medical officer, a major, who came on his rounds once a day, was called Raskolnikov. His hair was already grey and he had a moustache. We could tell how to a certain extent he put up with the misery which surrounded him, but he clearly regretted that he was not able to give better help. Time alone had been left to heal my wounds. There were neither medicines nor fresh dressings. I was urged by the German doctor to diligently practice stretching my left leg. A final test tap revealed that there was no more coming from the injury to my lungs. In Thorn, in the barracks, I was allowed to get out of bed and could move around the camp with a single crutch. As the doctor had threatened that he would sit on my crooked leg if I did not soon stretch it out again, I carried out the exercise diligently. Slowly, the condition of my leg returned to normal. In the camp at Thorn, for the first time, we came into contact with political propaganda. On large banners were written so-called sayings. They were mostly words of Lenin or Stalin with which we were confronted. The Hitlers come and go, but the German people, the German state will remain, went one Stalin quote. It had a surprisingly prophetic ring to it. As we received no kind of news or situation reports, we knew nothing of the progress of the war or even about the death of the Führer. Towards noon on the 8th of May 1945, it is true that the camp loudspeaker quite unexpectedly announced to us that the war was over. Germany, it said, had unconditionally surrendered. Some time afterwards, the sentries appeared also to have heard the news. They celebrated the event in their own way, by firing their ammunition off into the air. For us, this was not without its dangers, because ricochets were buzzing through the air, and bullets came through the wooden walls of the barracks. We, the conquered, meanwhile, lay on the floor of the barracks or on the sandy ground of the camp, scrabbling for safety on the ground. Hopefully it was for the last time. The camp complex included a sports ground, at the edge of which the convalescent officers lay in finished tents. I often visited them to get a change and to exchange ideas. They were waiting to be transported away. No one dared to think that some would be released and sent home. Perhaps one small Hauptmann would be lucky. Both his lower legs had been amputated below the knee, and he had thus become even smaller than he had otherwise been at his scant 5'2". He moved around on his hands and knees and made tiny leaps just like a sick frog. Among the closed circle of the officers, there was still the accustomed politeness. You addressed each other with Herr, whereas elsewhere it was soon the fact that you were addressed as Du by a class-conscious proletarian. In the company of those officers was a girl of 20, pretty as a picture, dazzlingly blonde, with bright blue eyes. She was the daughter of General Lasch, the commandant of Festung Königsberg, who had surrendered there. I wondered where and how such a girl could have survived the first assault. The Thorn camp was so gigantic that with my limited sphere of movement, I was not able to get an idea of the extent of it. It was said that 30,000 men lay within its barbed wire fences. Every few days, transports of ambulant prisoners left. They had been gathered into groups of a few hundred men and had left the camp. In Thorn, incidentally, I had met another man from Stockerau by the name of Franz Heinz. We had exchanged addresses, and I had given him a slip of paper for my relatives, as I suspected that he, because he was only a private soldier, would be released earlier than I would, because I was an officer. In actual fact, he was released as early as 1945, and my parents received the news I was alive only on Christmas Eve, the 24th of December. As it turned out, the next destination of the marching column was Graudenz, some 55 kilometers away. But the march had to be made on foot. There could have been 500 to 1,000 men who set off, after the fashion of the Red Army, each section consisting of 5 men. At the head there marched some 30 officers from Oberstleutnant to Lieutenant, with quite varying amounts of baggage. The gentlemen who had surrendered and had been taken prisoner uninjured had generally a lot of baggage. I and others only possessed the little we had been able to salvage from the military hospital in Danzig, and had been able to supplement during the course of the following weeks. I had only the underclothes I was wearing, my uniform tunic and trousers, a haversack and canteen, and an overcoat. Added to those, I believe, were a toothbrush, my paybook, my identification disc, and a couple of photos in my old plastic wallet. Franzl Manhart had already been allocated to an earlier transport, and we had therefore been separated. Another comrade whom I had found in Thorn I had lost again. He was Dr. Walter Rath, a Viennese whose home address was Hutteldorfer Strasse 333. Rath had studied Latin and Greek, was an educated Mittelschule teacher, but in the bad times before 1938 had been unemployed. He had therefore become a leader in the labour service. At first he was in the Austrian Labour Service, and afterwards in the Reich Labour Service. Towards the end of the war he had been transferred to the Wehrmacht as a Feldmeister, and had thus become a lieutenant. In the hospital barracks in Thorn he had been in the next bed. In about 1960 I met him again in the Salzburg officers' mess. He had transferred into the Austrian Bundesheer, and then, as a major, he was commandant of the Telegraph Battalion. He regretted that he had not met me years earlier. He had had trouble in proving his officer's rank, something to which I could have attested, at least for our time in Thorn, when we were still wearing badges of rank. The highest-ranking officer, and therefore the right-hand wingman in the first unit, was Oberstleutnant der Reserve Dr. Josef Deckwitz. He was a lawyer from Munster in Westphalia. From then on until I was released, with some interruptions, I was always together with Deckwitz. I shall speak of him many more times. Although by age he was born in 1896 and could have been my father, we had a close comradely relationship with each other. I owe him much for expanding my horizons. Deckwitz had been a flak officer. He had a huge ribcage and possessed a loud voice. He had, he said, been much in demand as a defence counsel in criminal cases, and his legal pleas were something worth hearing. Once, he said in a trial before a jury, knowing that from midnight of the next day an amnesty would come into force, he had pleaded for many hours to benefit his client. The court, he said, had patiently tolerated his constant repetitions. Before 1933, Deckwitz had been a social democrat. His wife was the niece of an SPD, if not a communist, member of the Reichstag who had emigrated to the Soviet Union. After graduating to my doctorate in 1952, I visited him in Munster and was delighted to see him again. His wife was interesting and clever. The great misfortune of the two of them was that their son, their only child, had completely ruined himself with drink. Although many healthy men capable of marching were in the column, it was still an unparalleled trail of misery. The armed sentries walked on all four sides of the column, but took careful notice of the many weak and feeble men. The distance of 55 kilometres, which healthy troops could have covered in one day's march, was tackled in 3 stages. Half was done on the first day, something that made demands on many men, leading to exhaustion. The other half was tackled in 2 days' marches, each of 12 kilometres. Obviously, the weakest men did not have the strength to walk further. I had recovered to such an extent, and had in the meantime learned again to stretch my left leg, that I managed all right. The worry of every man was always not to drop out of the column or be left behind, in order not to be shot by the guards, as had often happened. We spent the nights in barns on farms. If the sentries had not just dug out some women, and the women were not screaming out for help, you could get a bit of rest and sleep well in the straw. On the first day's march, we passed through the little town of Kulmsee. It had obviously been taken without any fighting. We were stared at by the Polish civilian population without visible hostility. In Graudenz, so word had gone round in the meantime, the transports were being assembled that would take us by railway into the interior of Russia. In Graudenz, we were gaped at by the civilian population. They were evidently more hostile than the population of Kulmsee, but there were no incidents. Our destination in Graudenz was a barracks complex. We were placed in groups of many men in completely empty rooms. But they were dry, and everyone had enough room to be able to stretch out. We remained in the barracks for 2 or 3 days and nights. Then it was time for us to march to the railway station to be loaded onto the trains. Today I can no longer remember whether the railway in the area occupied by the Russians had at that time already been converted to the Russian gauge, or whether this was not yet the case. But I do know that 20 men were stuffed into one goods wagon. Halfway between the floor and the roof, a shelf had been placed on both sides of the wagon doors. There we lay on the bare wood. There was no kind of comfort, neither straw nor hay, to relieve the hardness of the floor. The only necessary luxury was the availability of a hole in the floor of the wagon, some 20 mm in diameter, that served for the purposes of defecation. It was a simple solution, but an unpleasant one for those who, like me, were lying near to the hole. Fortunately, it was not necessary for urinating. That was done through the open wagon door. The transport train left Graudenz about the 20th of June. Nobody knew what its destination was. The rumor was that we were heading for Murmansk. It was one of the many topics of conversation in our officers' wagon. Nobody had been on the Murmansk front, but many of us knew what had happened there in the First World War. 70,000 of the German prisoners of war and 20,000 of the Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war set to work on building the Murmansk Railway had died. But as things turned out, everything was quite different than the Parolen, that is the rumour, would have it. After a relatively short journey via Deutsch Eylau and Allenstein, the transport came to a halt. It was the time before and during the Potsdam Conference. That was to be the last summit conference of the Big Three, of the anti-Hitler coalition of the Second World War. It was held in the Schloss Kekilienhof in Potsdam from the 17th of July to the 2nd of August 1945, and was between Truman, Stalin and Churchill or Attlee. The result of that conference was the Potsdam Agreement. In that agreement, subject to a final settlement of the territorial questions in a peace treaty, the town of Königsberg and the adjacent district of East Prussia were placed under the administration of the USSR. The border had hitherto existed between the USSR and Poland, and ran approximately along a line between the towns of Braunsberg and Goldap. The area to the north was allocated to the USSR. For our transport and us, it resulted in our destination being the part of East Prussia occupied by the USSR. We were not sent further on into the interior of the Soviet Union. The train was on the tracks for 5 weeks. I recall the summer of 1945 as being very hot. During those 5 weeks it did not rain on one single day. For a fortnight no one was allowed to leave the wagon. Only after that, during the remaining 3 weeks, did the guards allow us during the day to camp in a meadow alongside the train beside the tracks. Being allowed to do this made our stay more bearable than the first fortnight had been. The constricted conditions and the heat had thoroughly irritated us prisoners. Many of them worked themselves up into a proper fury. In our wagon, too, hostile words were exchanged. For instance, men who were on the lower bunks were disturbed by the feet of those lying above them. One man complained that when eating it was so dark that you couldn't even find the way to your mouth. He who said it was a Lieutenant Dr. Hess from Frankfurt am Main. He worked as a translator at IG Farben, spoke fluent English, French and Spanish, and had some interesting things to tell about his job. Hess was my neighbour, and we were both lying directly beside the notorious hole. Then there was a Hauptmann der Reserve Stolzner. He came, I believe, from Upper or Central Franconia. He was about 40 years old, and told of an elder brother who during the First World War had been taken prisoner by the Russians and had been sent to Siberia. From there he had fled to China and had attached himself as a military advisor to Marshal Chiang Kai-shek. His brother had married a Chinese woman, a fact that led in the wagon to a debate over the virtues of the women of another race. With the most earnest face, Stolzner told of a peculiarity of Chinese women. His assertion caused among some men a short, astounded amazement, until the laughter of the other men told them that Stolzner had been leading them up the garden path. As one of the naive and, moreover, still visibly fearful comrades, I recall Staff Paymaster Uhland. He was a descendant of the poet of the Schwäbische Kunde, but evidently was not so fearless as his ancestor was supposed to have been. While the war was still going on, rumours had been circulating that the poor quality soap there was at that time had partly been produced from human bones. That was something that seemed completely incredible. But then, after the war had ended, assertions concerning the atrocities practiced in German concentration camps were doing the rounds. It is true that our fear of being shot had in the meantime abated, but the future was completely unknown, and it seemed quite probable that we would be consigned to years of forced labour under inhuman conditions. It was therefore black humour when, in order to worry Herr Uhland, a man in the wagon asserted that the German officers who had been taken prisoner were going to be taken and turned into soap, and that well-nourished paymasters, such as Uhland, would be made into toilet soap. During the time we were kept in the transports, there were some deaths. The causes of death could not be established. Since there were no lists in existence, the only responsibility of the guards was to replenish the number of prisoners being transported. That was achieved by the guards swarming out and grabbing male German civilians, of whom there were still a few, there in Masuria. During the first period of our captivity in the East, there were no lists, and the prisoners were not recorded by name. The many who died of epidemics and hunger were never recorded. In my opinion, the real reasons that many years later, long after 1955, when the last prisoners were released, that people believed in the existence of so-called Schweigelager. Meanwhile, it is a fact that 1 in 3 soldiers who had come into the custody of the USSR did not survive his captivity and never returned. From my personal experience, I attribute that to the reasons I have mentioned above and to the wholly insufficient medical care which they received initially. Before the summer of 1945, I had not been acquainted with East Prussia. If there had not been the sadness that we experienced at the loss of a land through which we slowly travelled, it would have been a pleasure to see this friendly and cultivated land. From the train, as it travelled past the settlements and even the town of Allenstein, much seemed to have remained intact, but everywhere was depopulated. Only the summer sunshine stopped the landscape from giving a ghostly impression. Wistfulness seized the sensitive ones among us as we travelled through the station at Thurau, because many knew the song Anchen von Thurau. I must mention one more stop in Deutsch Eylau, where several thousand prisoners of war were encamped in a meadow. It was there, and not in Graudenz, that the final allocation and assembly of the transports for the East took place. In that meadow, as elsewhere, the officers were separated. It was there, completely surprised, that I met some gentlemen from our division. They were Major Ostreich, the divisional adjutant, and Hauptmann Franzen, the commander of the Signals Battalion. From the latter, I learnt that the division, before the surrender, had got to Bornholm by ship in a fairly good condition. They had thought themselves to be safe when 2 Russian torpedo boats appeared. The Danish island was occupied by the Russians, and all the Germans were taken prisoner. Ostreich did indeed know that Regiment 7 under Oberstleutnant von Gahn on the destroyer Karl Gulster had not made for Bornholm, but had set course for the Danish mainland. But it was not known whether the destroyer, and with it the remnants of the regiment, had got through. Ostreich, Franzen, and the other Bornholmers had until then been able to keep all of their baggage. They had evidently until then not been searched and not been plundered. A not-so-pleasant memory is that none of them offered me even a cigarette. Compared with them, I had nothing. I enjoyed smoking again, ever since the senior registrar Johansson in Danzig gave me a cigarette. He had said with a smile that I could forget my fear of not being able to smoke after the injury to my lung, but I could once again have that pleasure. In Deutsch Eylau, I also saw again the medic who had shamelessly bitten into the full block of chocolate in front of all the hungry men in our room. I refrained from speaking to him. Elsewhere on the meadow, a soldiers' choir was singing a song which at that time belonged to the firm repertoire of German Gesangvereine. Wenn ich den Wanderer frage, wo gehst du hin? Nach Hause, spricht mit frohem Sinn. If I ask the wanderer, where are you going? I'm going home, he says cheerfully. Here at least the German spirit, which had evidently remained intact, was still alive and kicking. We stayed a week in the area of the border that had just been drawn in Potsdam between Russia and Poland. There would not be a journey into the unknown lasting for weeks, as many men had feared. In Insterburg we had already reached our destination. I recall marching past the huge, undamaged Martin Luther Church. Then the column moved along the road over a valley bottom lined with poplars that stretched for a few kilometres. Our destination was the Jorgenberg camp, an old estate. In previous decades it had been home to a stud farm. Jorgenberg was the home of the Barings and was known to the educated German middle class from the novel of the same name. It was only after I returned home that I read Die Barings and its sequel Der Enkel by William von Simpson. But even in 1945, without knowing the novel, I could imagine clearly enough how things had been before and the defeat that had taken place. We marched along the drive and through a gate on which there was the date 1268 in old figures. There in Jorgenberg was Main Camp 445. Later it was called 7.445. It was the headquarters of the prisoner of war camps in the Russian-occupied part of East Prussia. From there, camps were established in Königsberg, in Tilsit, and in other locations in East Prussia. At that time, there was still the infectious diseases hospital in Insterburg that was later closed down. I cannot recall many facts from our short first stay there in Gorgenburg in the summer of 1945. The main thing I recall is the soup made out of turnip scraps. They constituted the main part of our food. The turnip scraps had been used as fodder for horses on the stud farm, and I cannot believe that this was unknown to the Russians. Then I recall that many officers, particularly staff officers, were there. Amongst them was an Oberst Rehmer, the elder brother of Major Rehmer. After the 20th of July 1944, Rehmer, on Goebbels's orders, had occupied the Bendlerstrasse with the Berlin Guard Battalion. He had crushed the rebellion, and for that had been personally promoted by Hitler to General Major. By contrast to that Rehmer, who was said to have been something of a simple unit officer, our Rehmer was a real man of the world with the best address and international experience. He had himself been military attaché in Spain, or had been attached to the military attaché. He could speak several languages, as once many Russian noblemen and Tsarist officers had done after the First World War. He had hoped to be able to see out the rest of his life as a hotel porter. I also recall the appearance of a quartet of men who sank the famous French hit song Parlez-moi d'amour to great applause. Tell me of happiness was the first line of the song in German. That much I understood. But I also recall some political speeches made by officers. They were attempts to come to terms with the new situation. They were completely apolitical men. Their world, their only world, had collapsed. Finally, I can still remember that there in the Jorgenberg camp, all insignia of rank had to be taken off, and all heads had to be shaved. We officers found that to be an additional humiliation. It was the intention that its main purpose was a hygienic measure to prevent epidemics. In the Red Army, shaven heads were the regulation, even if not for officers. Most of the prisoners in any case were suffering from diarrhea mixed with blood, like dysentery, for which there was no kind of help. Among the most significant industrial plants in East Prussia, where there was little industry, were the pulp factories attached to the Feldmühl concern. In Königsberg, they were the Werk Sackheim and the Werk Zosse. Those factories were supposed to be rebuilt by German prisoners of war as part of the restitution process. For that reason, there was a camp in Sackheim and another in Holstein, below the town, where the Priegel emptied into the freshwater lagoon. We had been transported on lorries from Jorgenburg to Königsberg. The town appeared to have been dreadfully destroyed. In Danzig, while being transported from the technical high school to the medical academy, I had happened to get a glimpse of the Marienkirche, the landmark of the town. There on the journey through Königsberg was offered sufficient opportunity to imagine how beautiful that town must once have been. We drove past the destroyed castle, and a comrade from Königsberg showed us where Kant's grave was. The British air raid of the 30th of August 1944 had turned the inner town into a heap of rubble. Before the town surrendered on the 9th of April 1945, the Russians had circled it to the north. The first suburb they had taken was Mettgethen. The Russians were in fact driven out of there again. But the fate of the inhabitants and of the refugees who had been caught by surprise was a terrible indication of what was waiting for the German civilian population. General Lasch, conscious of his responsibility for a large civilian population and for his troops who were uselessly shedding their blood, had surrendered the town on the 9th of April. He may thus have saved the lives of countless other people. But Hitler personally sentenced him to death by hanging, because he had not fought to the last man. Unspeakable things had then indeed gone on. In their despair, women and young girls had thrown themselves into the Priegel, or committed suicide in some other way. After the assaults, murders, arson and plundering, there came hunger and many deaths. Hugo Link, one of the few Protestant pastors to stay behind in Königsberg and survive, tells in his book Königsberg, 1945 bis 1948, that in autumn 1945, the number of Germans in Königsberg was still 96,000. The number of civilians in Königsberg during its last period as a Festung had been 126,000. Thus, in the course of half a year, 30,000 people must have died. Epidemics and hunger decimated the population still more, so that finally only 24,000 were left. They were to be transported away. According to that, more than 100,000 must have been snatched away by death. The prisoners of war were hermetically sealed off and guarded so intently that for most of them, or even all of them, no contact was possible with the civilian population. I cannot recall any particular occasion, even if now and again news of the civilian filtered through. The German camp leader of our small Holstein camp, which was supposed to hold 200 men, was Oberleutnant Karl from Königsberg. It was said that his family was still in the town. The process of living, suffering and dying thus went on unseen by the prisoners of war. Meanwhile, they had the certain feeling that their life was no longer directly under threat. I also, looking back, cannot say for certain that we were systematically exposed to starvation. The dreadful turnip scrap soup of Jorgenberg was replaced by sauerkraut, kapusta. There was a litre of that soup twice a day. The calculated ration of meat and fat, both of which were mixed into the soup, was 9 grams for meat and 12 grams for fat. There may well have also been at that time, I cannot now recall exactly, a tablespoon of sugar and bread, the ration for which was 600 grams per day. But the sugar, it was always unrefined sugar, was hardly ever edible, but mostly damp and heavy. It was generally known in all camps that the Russians responsible deviated from the set ration of food for the prisoners of war. The calculation was simple. If you mixed to the quantity of 10 grams of sugar 1 litre of water, you had got an additional kilogram left for private barter. It was a similar case with the bread, the kleb. There was an unimaginable difference, even while the war was still going on, between what we considered to be bread and the bread that the Russians provided. It must have been baked in moulds, in tin boxes, because with the unimaginably high water content, the dough would have run away. But the moulds had to be lubricated, and we never got to the bottom of the question as to whether this was done with petroleum or with engine oil. The crusts, the only parts that were baked through, sometimes tasted disgusting and smelled unpleasant. From time to time, a lot of oats were also mixed in. Many could not face the damp, badly baked bread, and for that reason often, if an oven was nearby, it was toasted, which gave off quite considerable clouds of steam. The weight of the toasted slices was considerably less than it had been before. Camp Holstein was in a plant that had been built in the interwar period, probably after 1933. It had housed an Army Optical Research Institute, or something of a similar name. 2 buildings measuring some 20 by 10 metres stood at right angles to each other. They had 2 stories and were built of red brick. The area was no larger than 2,000 or 3,000 square metres, and had been securely fenced in by the builders. The building to the right of the entrance ran at a right angle to the road and had been a workshop. From its roof you could see across the freshwater lagoon far to the west and to the south. The plant lay alone outside the settlement. In the first building there was still a lot of equipment from the time of its earlier use, in particular binocular periscopes, for which the Russians obviously had no use. The other building, lying parallel to the road, was where we were housed. The officers were quartered in some smallish rooms on the ground floor and on the first floor, and the other ranks in 2 large rooms. We officers had individual wooden beds, whereas the other ranks lay on bunks one above each other and subdivided. The German camp leader, Oberleutnant Karl, had a room of his own in which he lived with his assistant, another officer. In front of the accommodation building was the kitchen block from the time when the plant was in German hands. The running of the kitchen was the responsibility of 2 officers. They had been taken prisoner unwounded and were a picture of enviable strength and health. They used their position to divert rations to themselves. From the roof they had thoroughly observed the terrain, and one day in the spring of 1946 they disappeared. Many months later there was a rumour that their escape attempt had succeeded, and they were supposed to have written from Germany. Our workplace in the Holstein factory was about 3/4 of an hour away. We went there on a country road and passed a solitary house that had earlier been a simple inn. Oberleutnant Karl told us that, on our road over 200 years earlier, Immanuel Kant, the Königsberg philosopher, had gone for walks. He was said never to have left Königsberg, and yet in his lectures had been able to give exact descriptions of London and Paris, etc. The factory was already partly in operation again. We prisoners were detailed, in the Russian fashion, into so-called brigades, groups of about 10 men each. My brigade worked on making multi-layered wooden trestles that were used in the construction of a larger container. We worked under the direction of Russians, who were all members of the technical units, as shown in the names of their service ranks. So, for instance, the normal sub-lieutenant was called Mladší Technik Lieutenant, in German Untertechnik Leutnant. The so-called Nachalnik, the commandant in our area, was an elderly first lieutenant of good-natured appearance. He was a teacher from Tambov, a provincial town halfway between Moscow and Samara. The foreman was a sergeant major from Tomsk in Siberia, a skilled craftsman as far as I could judge. He must have been a mix of Russian and Mongolian. With him I had the impression that it embarrassed him that officers were performing menial tasks for him as prisoners. During the fighting, the high factory chimney had received a direct hit from an anti-tank gun, but it had only made a hole and had not brought down the chimney above it. To all appearances, the Russians had suspected there was an artillery observer on the flue and had wanted to clear him out. A topic of conversation was how, and by whom, the hole could be repaired. Rumour had it that a specialist, a Russian buzzword, had been offered 8,000 rubles to repair it. Such a specialist had been requested from Moscow and was already on the way. It was autumn. We had been working for some weeks in the factory. Our working hours were 10 hours a day, only Sunday was a day off. But one Sunday there was a voluntary work detail in which every prisoner capable of working had to take part. However, the unusual thing about it was that we did not have to go to work in the factory. We were loaded up on lorries and driven into the area of the new frontier between Russia and Poland. The process of drawing the frontier had apparently not yet been fully accomplished. In the frontier area, we had to gather up stinging nettles and similar weeds that were supposed to serve as fodder for horses. On that work detail, I must have caught a cold. The following Monday, I felt ill. With difficulty, I dragged myself to work in the factory. I was completely weak on the march back. I felt a stabbing pain in the right side of my chest that I could not explain. The lung that had been injured had been the left one. My strength deserted me more and more, and I was in danger of being left behind. The men next to me and behind me had apparently not noticed, and gradually I had reached the end of the column. I was afraid that I would soon collapse, when quite unexpectedly I got a hefty blow on my back. The frequent cries of "Dawai, Dawai" by the sentries who brought us, or rather drove us, to work, was something that we were used to, and were part of the prisoners' everyday experience. Until then, and I have to say, also later, there had not been any mistreatment. I fell, and it was only with difficulty that I could pull myself up again. But two comrades got hold of me under my arms and supported me on either side. They saw to it that I did not drop out of the column again. It was not the physical pain that hurt me and brought tears to my eyes. It was the mental torture I suffered through the degrading and humiliating mistreatment. I can still see the guard who hit me with the butt of his rifle in the small of my back. He was a young chap with a pretty face, if it had not been disfigured with pockmarks. Back in the camp I reported the incident, but Herr Karl could do nothing. The only thing was to be treated by a doctor. By the evening it was obvious that I was running a fever. Meanwhile, there was no doctor in our camp, only a field medical assistant who was a medical student without qualifications. As best he could, he fulfilled the function of camp doctor. It is true that he had a thermometer, a wooden stethoscope, a few dressings and iodine. He was an Upper Silesian by the name of Lebeck. He listened to my chest and diagnosed an inflammation of the lining of my lungs and my ribs on the right-hand side, but could only prescribe bed rest for me. Of course I was incapable of working. I had a fierce stabbing pain in the right side of my chest. The only treatment Lebeck could give me was repeatedly painting that side of my chest with iodine. He monitored my temperature and my general condition, but apart from that had to leave me to my fate. During the following weeks I ran a heavy fever. I lay on my bunk without straw mattress or blanket, dressed in my uniform and covered with my old overcoat. The days were bleak while my comrades were at work, and God knows I felt myself to be abandoned. There were no scales in the camp, so that it was only by seeing my bones protruding more and more, that I realized that I was losing more and more weight. We did not have a mirror in which I could have seen what I looked like. One time, when I had got out of bed, I saw that my knees were thicker than the bones of my upper leg. I was wasting away to a skeleton. I presented a similar picture to those I afterwards saw in photographs of the inmates of concentration camps. Night and day I used an empty jam tin as a urine bottle. I had to stand it next to my head so that I did not accidentally knock it over, and I could reach it with less effort. Throughout the winter, sick and weak, I remained in the camp. I could not and did not work. The winter, with temperatures as low as -15 degrees, was said not to have been a harsh winter for East Prussia. We had a stove in the room, so that at least cold was not added to hunger. There was also a good feeling of camaraderie in the cramped room. There was no one who acted in an underhand way, with one exception. He was, of all people, a circuit judge and a reserve Oberleutnant. He was once seen drinking a comrade's soup as he brought it from the canteen. Everyone could see how he was tortured by shame over this lapse, and so the incident was passed over in silence. It was a different kind of anger for the community when Herr Rauchfuss, in civilian life a police official from Potsdam, sold his watch. He had been able to hold on to it through several friskings. But then he did a deal with a Russian sentry who obtained for him some additional rations. In particular, he paid for a tin of American corned beef with a label in Cyrillic script. It was as painful for the rest of us to know of the existence of that supply as it must have been for Rauchfuss to eat those additional rations alone. He knew how much the others envied him, but camaraderie no longer extended to giving to other people even a bit on the end of a knife. Another man in our room was an artillery Oberleutnant Theo Kroon. He came from Leipzig, was a junior lawyer, and the son of a Reichsgerichtsrat. He occasionally spoke with pride of his father, who in his job was a leading jurist. After I returned home, I found out through Paul Eberhardt what a dreadful fate Krooner's family had met. In the artillery school in Göteborg, he had become acquainted with and married a girl from the nearby small town of Kallau, from where the Kalauers come. In the little town near Berlin, the family thought they would be safe and had fled from the bombed city of Leipzig to Berlin to his young wife's parents' house. Krooner spoke with great pleasure of his wife and his small son. He had a red moustache and had striking blue eyes. It was a cruel stroke of fate that the house in which the family was living, including those who had fled, received a direct hit. A total of 9 people lost their lives as a result. Paul Eberhardt, whom I have just mentioned, was Krooner's close friend. He came from Augsburg and had relatives in Bregenz. This had given him the idea of passing himself off as an Austrian. It was not important in the Holstein camp, but only later in Georgenburg. In Holstein, I was already instructing Paul about the importance and the significance of the Heimatschein for him, as an Austrian. In actual fact, he did succeed in getting released with us, and in getting back home to Augsburg. In later years, after my studies, I met him in Munich, where, with a PhD, he was working as an occupational psychologist. Paul Eberhardt was the same age as I was, but he looked a lot younger. He had a somewhat round face with blue eyes, and for a grammar school boy he was very well educated. In fact, he had already studied philosophy for 1 semester. He spoke about the art historian Warringer in Munich and about other professors. He was acquainted with publishing houses and had an eye for valuable books. It was he who brought back to the camp many books while on work details in Juditten and Mettgethen. One day Paul had been in the library of a Königsberg lawyer, Egon Friedel. He turned up with a 3-volume cultural history of modern times. It was a large first edition in greenish yellow. He worked his way through those volumes during the winter. He always underlined important parts as he did so, somewhat as my father and his father too had done. He also let me work on Friedel. I can still remember how we both agreed that we had found studying the introductory chapter particularly difficult, of the books that Paul brought back with him, and which I then read for the first time. Rudolf Georg Binding's Erlebtes Leben and Hans Karosser's Führung und Geleit were the best known. Other comrades in our room were Herr Straub, a lawyer from Düren near Aachen, and Herr Korte, who was a singer, a bass or baritone. I can remember that Korte would toast his bread on the stove in small strips and slices, and carefully distribute his sugar ration over them. A particular personality was Herr Bohm, a reserve hauptmann who had taken part in the First World War. Bohm called himself a lyricist, but I can no longer remember the quality of his poems. He was a gentleman of refined appearance with excellent manners and a cultured way of expressing himself. His Hochdeutsch had that certain East Prussian ring to it. I had the feeling that the downfall of his home city was a dreadful blow to him. I can still hear his voice when, in his East Prussian fashion, he would say to me, Herr Scheidebauerchen. I had the impression that he was a prosperous man and a bachelor. One time he gave us a laugh when he sang a popular song, full of black humour, from the period after the First World War. Wenn der Weißflieder wieder blüht, when the white lilacs bloom once more. Remarkably, I can still remember the title of one of his lyrical poems. It would have marked him out as an East Prussian dialect poet. I do not know whether that was really the case, but the poem was called Schalcher Flack, in Hochdeutsch, ein Schalchenfleck, or a little bowl of fleck. It referred to the sour Kuttelfleck, a favourite East Prussian dish. When my 22nd birthday came round, on the 13th of January 1946, I had recovered sufficiently to feel able to walk. It was a Sunday. I can remember it clearly, because for the first and only time there was meat in the soup for lunch. Because it was my birthday, like all birthday boys, I received an extra helping by order of the camp leader. I devoured it with the greatest enjoyment and without the slightest prick of conscience towards my comrades. After the meal, I realized that Fritz Sayel, a staff vet and Sudeten German, had not eaten with us. No one could explain why he was already full, but he was occasionally taken out of the camp by the Russians as a vet, so we thought he must have already eaten. On closer questioning, he replied after the meal, clenching both hands into fists, Solche Kavanen. He meant the state of the lungs of the horse he had been treating, and at the slaughtering and inspection of which he had been present. My first trip out beyond the camp fence may have been in January or February. In the camp, a comrade had died who had to be buried outside the camp. Herr Karl, the camp leader, took me with him a few steps outside the camp. There the grave had already been dug. It was by a hedge. The body was laid in the flat grave. Oberleutnant Karl said an Our Father. Then the grave was filled in. Then we went back to the camp. We were the few prisoners who were capable only of working inside. My last recollection of Holstein dates from March or April 1946. At that time we had received orders to erect round the camp a fence that was to some extent permanent. The Russians provided posts of over 2 meters high and many rolls of barbed wire. The posts were dug in or even concreted in, and then the wire was stretched over them. Stretching the wire with a tool designed for the purpose, I was able to get to work again for the first time. Slowly I felt my strength returning, even if I was still only capable of working inside. I even felt a certain satisfaction when I saw how tightly I had stretched the wire after the staples had been hammered in. But by the next day the tension had slackened because the material was already overstretched. The man directing the work was a Russian captain by the name of Mironov. He was the friendliest Russian that I met in captivity, not yet 30 years old, good-natured and kind. Blue-eyed and black-haired, he was smaller than me. He spoke a little German and was polite, almost comradely. But the notorious Skogo Damoy, that is home soon, was no more convincing from his mouth than it was from other Russians. Doubtless it was decently and sincerely meant. Meanwhile, we certainly were not going home soon. Although one day in April, we officers, with what little baggage we had, were loaded up onto lorries. But I was to encounter one more grotesque episode in the Holstein camp. For years I had carried in my right-hand top pocket a marching compass. It was the compass that had, in February 1945, prevented me from going in the wrong direction with my men. But then I thought that the possession of it might lead people to think that I was planning to escape. It was too risky to keep it, even if my physical condition ruled out any thought of escaping. On one occasion, as I went into the unused building in the camp where there were various types of optical equipment, I simply hid it. I decided I would certainly not need it anymore. In the event that it was found on me during a frisking, it would lay me open to extreme unpleasantness. But I was plain astonished when, a few weeks later, that very compass of mine was offered to me for sale. A Lanza had been rooting about in the building and had found my compass. He decided that it was very likely that an officer might be interested in acquiring it, as such an instrument would be necessary in any escape plan. Thanking him, I declined, without batting an eyelid. Soon afterwards, our miserable time in Königsberg came to an end. We officers were transferred back to the Jorgenburg camp. Of course, once more we were completely unsure as to what was going to happen to us. Indeed, right up to the last day of our captivity, there was complete uncertainty and unending anxiety. By then, the spring of 1946, the general situation had to a certain extent stabilized, if not improved. Our return to the main camp of Jorgenburg, which was probably better organized than the Holstein camp, seemed at any rate to be advantageous to us. In fact, the organization and accommodation in the many barracks did indeed seem to be better. That was evident even as we arrived. We were subjected to a thorough frisking. My paybook and my New Testament were taken away from me. Losing my paybook felt to me just like losing my identity. From then, I no longer had any document that could show who I was. I had nothing to show my name and rank, my date of birth, nor any other important dates. The seizure of my New Testament also hit me hard. It was the small pocket edition with the Psalter I had received as a present from Father. It had his dedication, 1,000 shall fall beside thee, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. From then I had to summon up from my memory the consolation I had often felt in reading it, but I had to continue to trust in my father's dedication. The Russian guards evidently had orders to confiscate all written and printed material. Even my request for them to leave me with my New Testament for cigarette papers met with no success. We new arrivals were also given an immediate medical examination. The examination was not even purely clinical, but really consisted in viewing the naked prisoners and pinching their backsides in order to determine the degree of dystrophy. Since I was extremely emaciated, I could not be put down as capable of working. I was quite happy about that, but I considered myself to be even more fortunate not to be placed in the tuberculosis barracks. The pointed noses of the men who were in the process of slowly dying there, beyond recovery, were frightening enough. In the spacious barracks where we Holsteiners joined the other officers in the camp, there was at last enough room for an individual to lead an existence that was halfway human. We slept on single beds placed in the room either individually, against a wall, or in twos next to each other. Every bed was provided with a straw mattress and a blanket. Among the inmates of the barracks, I was reunited with a whole series of acquaintances. Above all was Oberstleutnant Josef Job Deckwitz, whose Oberman in the bunk I was to be for a long time. Another sign of the organization in force was the fact that we were recorded on a register. That involved, at least for all officers, filling out questionnaires of several pages. Everyone had to answer 42 questions concerning his personal dates, and above all, the activities in which he had been engaged in the military. Our answers, in conjunction with denunciations by informers, provided the material that served as documentary evidence in the many war crimes trials that resulted in their cursory sentences of 25 years hard labor. From the start, I had provided true information. For instance, I had not concealed my rank as an officer, as many had done. Even in the camp at Thorn, when informally that was still possible, officers who had lost themselves in the ranks had acknowledged their rank. The constant fear of discovery, by comrades or fellow countrymen, in which those men lived, would have prevented me from taking such a step. Our answers, in conjunction with denunciations by informers, provided the material that served as documentary evidence in the many war crimes trials that resulted in their cursory sentences of 25 years hard labor. From the start, I had provided true information. For instance, I had not concealed my rank as an officer, as many had done. Even in the camp at Thorn, when informally that was still possible, officers who had lost themselves in the ranks had acknowledged their rank. The constant fear of discovery, by comrades or fellow countrymen, in which those men lived, would have prevented me from taking such a step. That was quite apart, too, from the fact that it would not have been in line with my natural honesty. As long as I had been with my unit, nothing had happened that could not be militarily justified, or that could have qualified as a war crime. So I was confident that no undeserved fate would overtake me. In actual fact, I had had nothing to fear. Even during our first stay in Jorgenburg in the summer of 1945, the heads of men and other ranks had been shaven. What we took to be a measure intended to humiliate us had obviously been necessary due to the completely unsatisfactory hygienic conditions. Many others suffered under such degradation. However, I resigned myself to the measure as a fateful means of enforcing conformity. I can still remember how many of us looked at each other in surprise. The disappearance of their hair had significantly altered the appearance of many men. The shape of the skull became a particular distinguishing feature. But we did not have to be subjected to that procedure a second time. Our insignia of rank had long since been removed, and a man who had previously been an officer could only be recognized by the material and cut of his uniform. But nevertheless, there were other signs too that distinguished the prisoners of war from each other. We could not believe our eyes when we saw on some caps small red or white and red coats of arms, and even some others of different colours. As it had been ordered by the camp authorities, it was pointless to let oneself be upset by it. It was an expression of the existing political situation, as it was known to us by hearsay. The German Reich, Greater Germany, had been completely conquered and shattered. Germany and Austria had each been divided into 4 zones of occupation, and no one knew what the borders of Germany would be in the future. So the Sudeten Germans cherished the illusion of eventually returning again to their homeland that had once again become part of Czechoslovakia. That was the case with staff vet Dr. Sayel and another comrade. Herr Grun, a qualified businessman from Saarbrücken, had studied in Paris before the war. He was distinguished by his knowledge of French food and reckoned that the Saar would become French. Thenceforward he considered himself French. For most Austrians, the situation seemed to be simple and clear. Of course, many of us could not hide the feeling that it was a shabby trick after our common defeat, now to separate ourselves. Should we follow the motto, every man for himself, and abandon our German comrades in arms to their fate? I also remembered literature concerning the First World War. The members of the successor states of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy had then deserted the flag that they had once served in common. I recalled the snide commentary with which that act had been portrayed. So now we were in the same situation. We deserted our common flag, and for this were given dirty looks by many of our German comrades. But no one knew how to answer the question as to what else we Austrians could have done. The thought that the Austrians would generally be released earlier than their comrades from the old German Reich was also by no means irrelevant to this issue. Who could have been criticized for trusting in that hope? Should we be like Paul Eberhardt, who, in the light of it, passed himself off as an Austrian? The fate of the Sudeten Germans had no doubt long since been decided. None of them knew what that decision was. We were cut off from our homeland. Until then, we had not even been allowed to write. The coats of arms on caps indicated at a stroke the problems thrown tee-up by that completely new situation. The Greater German Reich no longer existed. Hitler, to whom all of us had sworn an oath, was dead. It was therefore morally right and even necessary to declare our allegiance to our small Austrian homeland. We prisoners were each assigned to work details, according to our physical constitution. Work details 1 and 2 were completely capable of working and had to work outside the camp. Work detail 3, to which I belonged, was only capable of Innendienst. That is, we could only be used for work within the camp. We still had a few staff officers in the camp, including Dr. Deckwitz, and they too had to be employed within it. Of those, I can recall an Oberst der Reserve, about 50 years old, by the name of Kassel. He was a pharmacist. He had lost an arm and feared that he would not be capable of carrying out his profession, because he would no longer be able to mix up ointments. The oldest was Major Kischke, owner of a small East Prussian estate. I thought him to be between 60 and 70. He appeared old to me. Then there were a few gentlemen from Peenemünde, the experimental army rocket station. They had not been able to get to safety in time before the Russians arrived. An old major and former 12-ender was called Hinz. He had been the so-called Platzoffizier in Peenemünde. He had the furrowed face and the tanned skin of a native of the Alps, but in actual fact he was not. The most distinguished among the officers present was Oberleutnant Jürgens, a fighter pilot with, it was said, 88 victories. A young East Prussian was Hanschen Wiebernight. The nerves in both his lower arms had been damaged, but all the same he was capable of working. There was an established hierarchy in the camp. At the head were two former officers who had already been prisoners for some years and who had been in the National Committee Freist Deutschland. That National Committee had come into existence under and promoted by the Russians. It was composed of communist émigrés, such as the writer Erich Weinert and other prominent officers. It became well known after the disaster of Stalingrad, and especially through the name of General von Seydlitz. It claimed to be against fascism in the form of the Hitler dictatorship, and in this sense claimed to be collaborating in the political reconfiguration of the Germany of the future. Under the name Antifa, the group developed anti-fascist activities, in which, speaking reasonably, there was nothing to object to. The fact that it was actually the activity of a communist cell was something which, in my youthful naivety, I neither recognized nor realized, particularly since its officials with whom I came in contact were, to all appearances, reasonable and decent human beings. The two officers just mentioned were called Kubarth and Gless. One of them was the first camp leader, while Willy Gless was in charge of political indoctrination. Among the camp officials there were also three Austrians. They were Alois Strohmeyer from Donowitz, a Styrian communist, Karl Kohler from Eisenstadt, the son of a social democratic member of the Landtag, and the camp clerk Oskar Stockhammer, an active Unteroffizier in the Austrian Bundesheer, who later became a police official in Salzburg. Stockhammer was not a communist. He had an unhappy marriage, but was a good Catholic. Until he died, he could never bring himself to get divorced from the wife whom he did not love, and who was considerably older. I came into friendly contact with Stockhammer, who was my elder by 10 to 15 years. It was with his help that I became involved in the area of managing the camp. There were many German books in the camp, and many more had been brought into the camp from outside by the work details. Orders were then issued that those books should be checked in order to weed out not only National Socialist literature, but also literature that did not accord with the anti-fascist ideology. All that came about as the unexpected result of contact with the camp leaders. In my naivety, that was something I had not reckoned with. It meant that I was then morally compelled to take part in the recruitment and educational events organized by the Antifa.